The stars looked peaceful through the window of the Valiant's bridge. Commander Jake Morrison stood with his hands behind his back, watching the distant lights of New Haven Colony growing larger on the screen. It was supposed to be a simple supply run: food, medicine, and construction materials for the 50,000 humans who called that frontier world home. Jake had made this trip a dozen times before. Nothing ever happened out here in the quiet edge of Council space. His communications officer, Lieutenant Sophie Clark, sat at her station running through the standard check-in protocols. The colony should have responded by now. She tried again, her fingers moving quickly across the controls. Still nothing. She looked back at Jake with concern in her eyes. Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. 5 years ago, humanity had joined the Galactic Council with such hope. Earth had finally made contact with alien civilizations. Hundreds of species, thousands of worlds, all working together. Or so they had been told. The reality had been different. Most of the older species looked at humans like children who had wandered into an adult conversation. They smiled and nodded, but never really listened. The Valiant pushed forward, its engines humming steadily. They were still 3 hours out from New Haven. Jake ordered the crew to battle stations anyway. Something felt wrong. After 20 years in space, he had learned to trust that feeling. 2 hours later, they received the first transmission. It was broken and full of static, but Governor Lisa Turner's voice came through clearly enough. She was screaming. In the background, Jake could hear explosions and the sound of people crying. Lisa was trying to tell them something about ships, about an attack, about the Krell. Then the transmission cut off completely. Jake ordered maximum speed. The Valiant surged forward, pushing its engines past safety limits. The crew worked in tense silence. Everyone knew what they might find when they arrived. The Krell Dominion was one of the older civilizations in the galaxy. They controlled nearly 40 star systems and had a military that made most other species nervous. The Krell were tall reptilian creatures with sharp minds and sharper tempers. They believed strongly in their own superiority and had ancient claims to half the galaxy based on maps that were thousands of years old. Humanity had known there might be disputes about New Haven. The system sat in an area that old Krell charts marked as their territory. But those charts were from a time before the Council existed. Modern law said that unclaimed systems could be settled by anyone. Earth had followed all the proper procedures, filed all the correct paperwork. The Council had approved the colony 5 years ago. Apparently, the Krell had decided that didn't matter. When the Valiant finally arrived at New Haven, Jake wished they had stayed away. The colony was burning. Fires dotted the surface of the planet like angry red wounds. Debris floated in orbit, pieces of the defense stations that had protected the colonists. 3 massive Krell warships hung in space above the planet, their dark hulls reflecting the light of the flames below. Jake's tactical officer reported that all the colony's defenses were destroyed. The shields were down. The weapon platforms were gone. There were no human ships left in the system except for the Valiant. Against 3 Krell warships, they wouldn't last 5 minutes. The Krell commander sent them a message. His name was Vec, and he appeared on the screen with cold satisfaction in his yellow eyes. He told Jake that the colony had been removed for trespassing on Krell territory. It was a matter of law and order. He suggested that the Valiant leave immediately unless they wanted to join the colonists. Jake wanted to fight. Every part of him screamed to fire weapons and make the Krell pay for what they had done. But he had 40 crew members who trusted him to keep them alive. He had a duty to get home and report what happened. So he ordered the retreat, and the Valiant jumped away into hyperspace. He watched the burning planet disappear from the screens and felt something break inside him. The journey back to Earth took 4 days. Jake spent most of that time writing his report and trying to count how many people he knew on New Haven. His friend Carl had been down there with his wife and 2 kids. Lieutenant Williams had a sister in the science division. The numbers kept adding up until Jake stopped counting. When they reached Earth, Jake was immediately called to testify before the military council. He stood in the briefing room and told them everything he had seen. 48,000 people dead, the colony completely destroyed, the Krell claiming it was their legal right. Admiral Richard Cole listened to the report with a face like stone. He was an older man with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many wars. When Jake finished speaking, the Admiral asked just one question. Were the Krell still in the system? Jake said yes, they were probably setting up their own outpost there now. The Admiral nodded slowly and thanked Jake for his service. Then he sent the report up the chain to President Helen Brooks. The president called an emergency meeting of the Galactic Council. Earth's ambassador made a formal complaint and demanded justice. They presented evidence of the massacre, showed images of the burning colony, and played the recording of Governor Turner's final transmission. The ambassador asked the council to condemn the Krell attack and force them to pay for what they had done. The council chambers were huge, a circular room where representatives from 200 civilizations sat in floating platforms that ringed the central floor. Chancellor Koresh presided over the session from his elevated position. He was a Venturi, a species known for their diplomatic skills and their love of procedure. Chancellor Koresh listened to Earth's complaint with what looked like sympathy. Then he called on the Krell ambassador to respond. Commander Vec appeared and spoke with confidence. He explained that the Krell had ancient claims to that region of space. The maps were thousands of years old and took precedence over recent council rulings. The humans had been warned unofficially that their presence was not welcome. They had chosen to stay. What happened was unfortunate but legally justified. The council debated for 6 hours. Some species argued that the attack was too extreme. Others said that territorial disputes were complicated, and both sides probably had valid points. A few suggested that a committee should be formed to study the issue and make recommendations in a few months. Not a single civilization called it what it was: murder. In the end, Chancellor Koresh announced that the council would establish a special investigation committee. They would review all the territorial claims and try to reach a fair conclusion. In the meantime, both Earth and the Krell were asked to show restraint and avoid escalating the situation. He expressed his hope that this matter could be resolved through peaceful dialogue. The Earth ambassador asked what would happen to the 48,000 dead colonists. Chancellor Koresh said their deaths were tragic and would be taken into consideration during the investigation. Then he moved on to the next item on the council agenda. Back on Earth, President Brooks watched the council session with her advisors. When it ended, she sat in silence for a long moment. Then she dismissed everyone except Admiral Cole. The admiral knew what was coming. He had fought in the last great war between human nations back before first contact. He remembered what it meant when diplomacy failed and good people died, while others talked about committees and procedures. President Brooks looked tired. She had spent 5 years trying to build good relationships with the other species. She had believed in the council and what it represented. Now she understood that humanity was alone out here. The other civilizations would talk and debate and form committees, but they wouldn't help. They wouldn't stand up for what was right because it might be inconvenient. She asked the admiral about Project Sentinel. He told her it was ready. Everything they had been building in secret for the past 3 years was operational. The ships, the weapons, the training, all of it was prepared for this exact situation. The president thought about the families who died on New Haven. She thought about the message it would send if Earth did nothing. She thought about the next colony that would be attacked because the galaxy had learned that humans could be killed without consequences. Then she gave the order to activate Project Sentinel. Admiral Cole left the room to begin mobilization. President Brooks sat alone in her office and looked at the pictures on her desk. One showed her shaking hands with Chancellor Koresh at Earth's induction ceremony. Everyone had been smiling. She picked up the photo and put it in a drawer where she wouldn't have to look at it anymore. Outside her window, the sun was setting over Washington. In a few hours, Earth would begin recalling all its diplomats and trade vessels from Council space. Within a day, humanity would go silent and the galaxy would think it was because they were afraid. Let them think that, the president decided. Let them believe humans were cowards who ran away from fights. They would learn the truth soon enough. Earth had spent 5 years watching and learning from the other species. They had studied Krell tactics and council politics. They had built weapons in secret and trained crews who knew how to use them. Now the galaxy was about to discover what humans did when The recall order went out at midnight. Every human diplomat, trader, and civilian working in council space received the same message. Return to Earth immediately. No exceptions. No explanations. Ambassador Paul Grant had been at a reception on the Ventari homeworld when his communicator buzzed with the emergency code. He excused himself from the party, returned to the embassy, and began the evacuation procedures he had hoped never to use. His staff moved efficiently, burning sensitive documents and packing essential equipment. Within 6 hours, the embassy was empty, and the human delegation was on a ship heading home. Similar scenes played out across the galaxy. Trade vessels cut short their delivery routes and plotted courses back to Sol system. Research teams abandoned their projects. The human presence in Council space simply evaporated overnight like morning dew under a hot sun. The other species noticed immediately. Some thought Earth was throwing a diplomatic tantrum over the Council's response to New Haven. Others wondered if humanity was preparing to make some kind of demand. The Krell laughed and said it proved humans were weak, unable to handle the harsh realities of galactic politics. Chancellor Koresh sent several messages to President Brooks asking for clarification. She did not respond. He tried to reach Ambassador Grant. The communications went unanswered. After 3 days of silence, the Chancellor made a public statement expressing disappointment in humanity's inability to resolve conflicts through proper diplomatic channels. He called it immature and beneath what he had hoped from Earth. If he had been able to see what was happening in the Sol system, he might have chosen different words. Admiral Cole stood on the command deck of the orbital station high above Earth and watched as the hidden military infrastructure came to life. All around the solar system, bases that had been disguised as civilian installations were revealing their true purpose. Weapon platforms deployed from behind asteroids. Shipyards that supposedly built cargo haulers opened their doors to show warships bristling with guns. For 3 years, Earth had been preparing for this possibility. While diplomats smiled and talked about peace, engineers and soldiers had been working in secret. They had built a military force that could match any civilization in the Council. They had just been very careful not to let anyone know it existed. The ships were the key to everything. Earth had purchased 30 old cargo vessels from various alien manufacturers, claiming they needed them for expanding trade routes. Those ships had been taken to hidden shipyards beyond Jupiter and completely rebuilt. Their outer hulls stayed the same, but inside everything changed. Cargo holds became weapons bays. Simple engines were replaced with military-grade drives. Civilian sensors were upgraded to military standards. Captain Andrew Harris walked through the corridors of the Retribution and still marveled at the transformation. 6 months ago, this ship had been called the Peaceful Trader and carried grain between colonies. Now it was a destroyer with enough firepower to take on a Krell cruiser. The crew had trained for this moment, running combat drills in the outer reaches of the solar system where no one would see them. Andrew gathered his officers in the briefing room and went over the mission one more time. They would be part of the first strike group, hitting Krell military installations in the Dracor system. Speed and surprise were essential. Get in, destroy the targets, and get out before the Krell could mount an effective response. His tactical officer, Lieutenant Kevin Barnes, brought up the holographic display of their target. It was a fortress station that served as a regional command center for Krell military operations. The station had shields, weapons, and housed nearly 10,000 Krell soldiers. It had never been successfully attacked in its 200-year history. That was about to change. In Nevada, Dr. Nathan Pierce watched as the last of the antimatter warheads was loaded onto a transport vehicle. Each warhead contained enough destructive force to vaporize a small moon. The weapons were based on principles that most Council species considered too dangerous to weaponize. Matter and antimatter meeting in perfect annihilation, converting mass directly into energy according to Einstein's famous equation. The Galactic Council had banned antimatter weapons 70 years ago, after a war between two civilizations had nearly destroyed an entire sector. The treaty was very clear. No member species could develop, build, or deploy antimatter devices for military purposes. Earth had never signed that treaty. They had joined the Council after it was written, and nobody had thought to make them sign it retroactively. It was an oversight, a small detail lost in the paperwork of adding a new species to the organization. Now that oversight was going to cost the Krell dearly. Nathan had argued against building these weapons. He understood the physics of what they could do, the horrible efficiency of pure annihilation, but he also understood necessity. When the President had asked him if Earth could defend itself against species with centuries more experience in space warfare, he had been honest. Not with conventional weapons, but with these, yes. Now they existed and now they would be used. Nathan sent the confirmation code that released the warheads to the military. Then he went home and tried not to think about how many people were going to die. Lieutenant Maya Foster sat in a dark room filled with computer screens and coordinated the intelligence network that Earth had built over 5 years. Most people thought humanity was naive about galactic politics, too trusting and too open. That was deliberate. While appearing innocent, Earth had been recruiting sources, planting listening devices, and mapping out the military capabilities of every major civilization. Maya had agents on 17 worlds. Some were humans who had taken jobs with alien companies. Others were aliens who had been convinced that working with Earth was profitable or ideologically appealing. They sent back information on ship movements, military readiness, political discussions, and technological capabilities. Right now, Maya was tracking the Krell fleet. She knew where every major warship was located. She knew their patrol routes, their communication codes, and their response times. She had built a complete picture of Krell military operations, and that picture was being shared with every strike group in the human fleet. The Krell had no idea. They had been so confident in their superiority that they never considered humans might be spying on them. It was going to be a fatal mistake. Maya sent the final intelligence update to Admiral Cole and allowed herself a small smile. The Krell had killed 48,000 people on New Haven. They thought there would be no consequences because humanity was weak and the Council would do nothing. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. Admiral Cole reviewed the battle plans one last time. 30 ships divided into 7 strike groups. Each group had specific targets spread across Krell space. The attacks would happen simultaneously, hitting the Krell from multiple directions at once. By the time they realized what was happening, it would be too late to mount an effective defense. The plan was brutal and uncompromising. No warnings would be given. No surrender would be offered initially. The goal was to cripple the Krell military so completely that they could never threaten human colonies again. Cole knew that some people would call it excessive. Some would say it made Earth no better than the Krell themselves. He had made peace with that. Sometimes being the good guy meant making hard choices. Sometimes protecting your people required actions that kept you awake at night. Cole had been a soldier for 40 years. He knew the cost of war and the greater cost of allowing evil to go unchallenged. President Brooks came to the station to see the fleet off. She walked among the crews, shaking hands and thanking them for their service. Many of these men and women had families. Some of them might not come home. They all knew the risks and had volunteered anyway. She found Commander Jake Morrison preparing his ship for departure. The Valiant had been repaired and upgraded since its escape from New Haven. Jake looked older than he had a month ago. The guilt of surviving when so many others died had marked him deeply. The president told him that what happened at New Haven was not his fault. He had done everything right. Sometimes the universe was just cruel and unfair, but now they had a chance to bring justice for those who died. She asked if he was ready. Jake looked at her with hard eyes and said he had been ready since he watched that colony burn. He would make the Krell pay for every life they took. He would make sure the galaxy remembered that humanity protected its own. The president nodded and moved on to the next ship. When she had spoken to all the crews, she returned to the command center where Admiral Cole was waiting. They stood together and watched as the fleet began moving out of Earth orbit. The ships formed up in precise formations, their hulls dark against the stars. One by one, they accelerated toward the edge of the solar system where they would jump into hyperspace. It was a magnificent and terrible sight, humanity's answer to the massacre at New Haven, written in steel and antimatter. Ambassador Grant stood on the observation deck and watched the fleet depart. He had been recalled from the Council to help with what came after the military operation. Somebody would have to explain to The attack began exactly at 0600 Galactic Standard Time. Across 7 star systems, human warships dropped out of hyperspace and opened fire before the Krell even knew they were there. Captain Andrew Harris brought the Retribution into normal space just 5,000 kilometers above Dracor Prime's military fortress. His crew had practiced this jump 100 times in simulation. They had 30 seconds before the fortress detected them and raised shields. 30 seconds to launch their weapons and do maximum damage. Andrew gave the order and his weapons officer released a full spread of antimatter torpedoes. 6 brilliant points of light streaked across the darkness toward the fortress. The Krell station's automated defenses started to activate, but they were designed to stop plasma weapons and missiles that took time to reach their targets. They were not designed for weapons that traveled at near light speed. The torpedoes hit the fortress with the force of small suns. Matter met antimatter and ceased to exist, replaced by pure energy that tore through shields and armor like they were paper. The fortress, a structure that had stood for 2 centuries as a symbol of Krell military power, simply vaporized. One moment it existed, the next there was only an expanding cloud of superheated gas and debris. Andrew watched the explosion on his screens and felt no satisfaction. He had just killed 10,000 Krell soldiers. They died instantly, never knowing what hit them, but they were still dead. He pushed the thought away and ordered his crew to the next target. There would be time for guilt later. Right now they had a job to finish. 3 systems away, Commander Jake Morrison led his strike group against the Krell fleet yards at Vengir Station. This target was more challenging because it was mobile and better defended. The station housed 12 Krell warships under construction and had extensive shields and weapons platforms. Jake's group consisted of 5 destroyers. They came out of hyperspace in a wolf-pack formation, surrounding the station from multiple angles. The Krell defenders reacted quickly, bringing shields online and launching fighters, but they were confused. Human ships were not supposed to be here. Earth was supposed to be cowering in fear after New Haven. The human ships did not fight the way Krell expected. Instead of forming battle lines and exchanging fire until one side's shields failed, they darted in and out like sharks. They would fire a barrage of missiles, then speed away before the Krell could target them effectively. When the Krell tried to pursue, other human ships would hit them from a different angle. Lieutenant Kevin Barnes, serving as tactical officer on Jake's ship, coordinated the attack pattern. He had studied every major space battle in Council history and noticed something interesting. Most species fought in predictable ways, following doctrines that were centuries old. They valued honor and proper military conduct. Humans valued winning. The Vengir Station's shields began to fail under the sustained assault. The Krell commander tried to call for reinforcements but found that his communications were being jammed. Maya Foster's agents had planted viruses in the Krell military network, and now those viruses activated. Orders were scrambled. Distress calls went to the wrong systems. The Krell military infrastructure began to collapse from within. Jake's ships pressed their advantage. When the station's shields finally fell, they launched a coordinated missile strike that destroyed the dry docks and half the ships under construction. Secondary explosions rippled through the station as fuel and ammunition detonated. The Krell crews evacuated in escape pods and Jake let them go. This was not about killing everyone. It was about destroying the ability of the Krell to threaten human worlds. High above the Krell homeworld of Krellvan, the situation was even more chaotic. A dozen orbital defense platforms that had protected the planet for 300 years were under attack by Captain Daniel Price's strike group. These platforms were legendary, said to be impenetrable. They had shields that could absorb the firepower of an entire fleet. Daniel's ships proved that legend wrong. They used railguns, weapons that fired solid projectiles at relativistic speeds using magnetic acceleration. The Krell had never encountered such weapons before. Their shields were designed to disperse energy weapons and detonate explosive missiles. They did nothing against chunks of dense metal traveling at a significant fraction of light speed. The projectiles punched through shields and armor with terrifying efficiency. Each round carried such kinetic energy that when it hit, it created localized fusion explosions from the sheer force of impact. One by one, the orbital platforms were reduced to wreckage. The Krell crews fought bravely, but they were fighting a type of warfare they had never trained for. Daniel kept his ships moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough for the Krell to coordinate their return fire. His pilots were exhausted from the high-speed maneuvers, but they held formation perfectly. This was what they had trained for during all those secret exercises beyond Jupiter. Within 3 hours of the initial attack, the Krell military was reeling. They had lost major command centers, fleet yards, and defensive positions. Their communication network was compromised. Their reinforcements were being sent to wrong locations based on false intelligence. The sophisticated military machine that had dominated this region of space for centuries was falling apart. The Krell High Command tried to make sense of the chaos. How did Earth have this many ships? Where did they get these weapons? The intelligence report said humanity barely had a defense force capable of protecting their home system. Yet here were dozens of human warships operating with coordination and skill that rivaled the best Council militaries. Commander Vec, who had ordered the destruction of New Haven, was at the Krell Naval Academy when the attacks began. He watched the reports coming in with growing disbelief. This could not be happening. Humans were weak. They talked about peace and cooperation, They did not have the stomach for real warfare. He sent urgent messages to the human fleet demanding they cease fire immediately. He received no response. He sent messages to the Galactic Council demanding they intervene. Chancellor Koresh sent back that the Council was in emergency session, trying to understand the situation. Vex screamed at his communicator that understanding could wait. The humans were destroying the Krell military right now. But the Council moved slowly and the humans moved very fast. Admiral Cole monitored the battle from Earth's command center. His screens showed reports from all 7 strike groups. The operation was going better than planned. Casualties were lighter than expected. The Krell were disorganized and unable to mount effective resistance. Part of him felt grim satisfaction at how thoroughly they were defeating an enemy everyone thought was superior. Another part of him was horrified at what they were doing. This was the largest military operation humanity had ever conducted. They were attacking another civilization on a scale that had not been seen in Council space for decades. The careful diplomatic relationships Earth had built over 5 years were burning just as surely as the Krell installations. But Cole had learned long ago that command meant making hard choices. Someone had to be willing to do what was necessary, even when it was terrible. The Krell had murdered 48,000 colonists and faced no consequences. If Earth did not respond, it would tell every aggressive species in the galaxy that humans were acceptable targets. President Brooks stood next to the Admiral and watched the tactical displays. She had given the order that started all of this. The weight of every death, human and Krell, would rest on her conscience for the rest of her life. She accepted that burden. Leaders who ordered others to fight had an obligation to feel the cost of those decisions. The strike groups began reporting mission completion. The fortress at Drakor Prime was destroyed. Venger Station was crippled. The orbital defenses of 3 Krell colonies were eliminated. The fleet yards at 2 major systems were burning wreckage. Across Krell space, the military infrastructure that had taken centuries to build was being reduced to debris. Then Commander Jake Morrison transmitted his final objective. He was taking his group directly to Krellvan itself, the Krell homeworld. Admiral Cole watched the tactical display and felt his heart rate increase. This was the most audacious part of the plan, and the most dangerous. Jake's ships came out of hyperspace in orbit of Krellvan. The planet was beautiful from space, with green continents and blue oceans. 3 billion Krell lived on that world. It was the heart of their civilization, their culture, their identity. The Krell defenders went into full panic. Human ships were above the homeworld. This had never happened before. Every weapon on the planet's surface aimed upward. Hundreds of fighters launched from air bases. The remaining orbital platforms moved to intercept. But Jake was not there to attack the planet. His orders were specific: destroy the military infrastructure, but leave the civilian population untouched. Show the Krell that Earth could have killed everyone if they wanted to, but chose mercy instead. His ships systematically destroyed every military satellite, weapon platform, and orbital installation protecting Krellvan. They ignored the fighters that swarmed around them, focusing only on the strategic. The Galactic Council chambers had never been so crowded. Representatives from every member civilization demanded entrance to the emergency session. Some arrived in person, others joined through holographic projection, but everyone wanted to be present for what was being called the most important council meeting in 50 years. Chancellor Koresh looked exhausted as he called the session to order. He had spent the last 3 days trying to manage the crisis and failing badly. The careful political balance he had maintained for decades was collapsing. Species that had been allies for centuries were now arguing. Old grievances were being brought up. The foundation of council unity was cracking. He began by summarizing the situation. Earth had conducted a massive military operation against the Krell Dominion in response to the destruction of New Haven Colony. Preliminary reports indicated that the Krell had lost approximately 40% of their military capability. Hundreds of installations destroyed, thousands of soldiers killed, and their homeworld left defenseless. The council erupted into shouting. The Ventari ambassador demanded that Earth be immediately expelled and sanctions imposed. The Hexian delegate argued that the Krell had started the conflict by attacking a civilian colony. The Torvan representative wanted to know why the council had not protected Earth in the first place. Others joined in until the chamber was filled with overlapping voices in dozens of different languages. Chancellor Koresh tried to restore order, but it took nearly 30 minutes before everyone quieted down enough for the session to continue. When silence finally returned, he called on Commander Vec to make a statement on behalf of the Krell Dominion. Vec appeared different than he had a month ago. The arrogance was gone, replaced by barely controlled fury. He stood at the central podium and his hands shook as he gripped the edges. He spoke of the unprovoked human aggression, the violation of Council rules of warfare, and the illegal use of antimatter weapons. He demanded that the Council authorize a coalition force to punish Earth for these crimes. Then he asked the question that everyone was thinking. Which civilizations would contribute ships to this force? Who was willing to go to war with humanity? The chamber fell completely silent. Representatives looked at each other, but no one volunteered. The truth was obvious to everyone present. Earth had just demonstrated military capabilities that rivaled any civilization in the Council. They had planned and executed a complex multi-system operation with efficiency that most species could not match. Whoever went to war with humanity would pay a heavy price. More than that, many Council members were quietly impressed by what Earth had done. For years, they had watched aggressive species like the Krell push around weaker civilizations, while the Council talked and formed committees. Now someone had finally pushed back hard enough to make it hurt. Some representatives were not ready to say it publicly, but privately they were glad. The Torvan ambassador was the first to speak after Vec's question went unanswered. The Torvans were a mercantile civilization that valued profit and stability. Their representative was a practical being who understood that the galaxy had just changed, and smart species would adapt to the new reality. She said that while Earth's actions were extreme, perhaps the Council needed to examine its own failure to protect member colonies. If the Council had responded appropriately to the New Haven massacre, Earth would not have felt the need to take independent action. The Torvan Collective was not prepared to condemn Earth without acknowledging the circumstances that led to their response. Other moderates began speaking up. The Hexians pointed out that the Krell had never been formally punished for destroying New Haven. The Alanki delegate mentioned that the Krell had violated territorial agreements with 3 other species in the past decade and faced no consequences. A pattern was emerging, and it was not flattering to the Krell. Commander Vec grew more agitated as the session went on. He had expected the Council to rally to the Krell cause. Instead, they were debating whether the Krell deserved what happened to them. He shouted that this was about human aggression and illegal weapons, not about rehashing old territorial disputes. Chancellor Koresh finally had to ask Vec to step down from the podium. The Krell commander refused and had to be removed by security. It was an embarrassing moment that weakened the Krell position even further. The session continued for 12 more hours. Various proposals were debated. Some wanted harsh sanctions against Earth. Others wanted to censure the Krell. A few suggested that both sides should be punished equally. In the end, the Council voted to establish another investigation committee and strongly urged both Earth and the Krell to accept mediation. It was a typical Council response that satisfied no one and solved nothing. But it also meant that Earth would not face immediate consequences for what they had done. The galaxy was not ready to punish humanity, because too many species secretly agreed that the Krell had earned their defeat. While the Council debated, the real consequences were playing out across the galaxy. 4 star systems that had been under Krell control declared their independence. They had been waiting for a moment of weakness, and Earth had just provided it. The Krell tried to send military forces to restore control, but discovered they did not have enough ships anymore. Other aggressive civilizations that had been quietly planning their own territorial expansions suddenly became very cautious. The Drexen hegemony, which had been massing ships near the border of a weaker neighbor, suddenly withdrew them. The Kalthar Empire canceled plans to annex an independent mining colony. Throughout Council space, bullies reconsidered their plans. The message was clear. If you attacked human colonies, humanity would hit back with overwhelming force, and maybe other species would start doing the same thing. On Earth, the returning fleet was met with mixed reactions. Captain Andrew Harris brought the retribution home to cheering crowds in some cities and angry protesters in others. Society was divided about what had been done in their name. Some saw it as necessary justice. Others called it genocide and war crimes. Harris walked through the protests on his way to a debriefing and tried not to make eye contact with the angry faces. A young woman shouted at him, asking how many children had died when he destroyed that fortress. He wanted to tell her that the fortress was a military installation with only adult soldiers, that they had been careful to avoid civilian casualties. But he kept walking because he knew it would not matter. She had already decided he was a monster. Maybe she was right. He had killed thousands of beings with the push of a button. The fact that they were enemy soldiers following orders did not make them less dead. Harris had known this job would cost him sleep and peace of mind. That was the price of command in wartime. Admiral Cole met with his senior officers and reviewed the mission results. Strategically, it had been a complete success. The Krell were crippled and would need years to rebuild. Humanity's position in the galaxy was now backed by demonstrated military power. No species would make the mistake of thinking humans were weak again. But Cole also read the casualty reports and the cost assessments. 32 human personnel killed in action. Estimated Krell casualties between 8 and 10,000. Destruction of infrastructure worth trillions in resources. The diplomatic relationships that would take decades to repair. Commander Jake Morrison sat alone in his quarters aboard the Valiant and stared at the blank wall. He had delivered the ultimatum at Krellvon and meant every word. But now that the fury of combat had faded, he was left with the weight of what they had done. He had taken his ship to the enemy homeworld and threatened 3 billion people. For a cause he believed in, for justice he thought was right, but it still felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. His door chimed and he found Captain Andrew Harris standing outside. They had not seen each other since before the mission. Harris asked if he could come in and Jake nodded. They sat in silence for a while. Two men who had done terrible things for good reasons and were not sure how to process it. Finally, Harris spoke. He said that his daughter had asked him if he was a bad person now. She was 7 years old and saw the protesters on the news calling him a war criminal. He had tried to explain about New Haven and protecting people, but she did not understand. How do you explain necessary evil to a child? Jake said he did not know, but he knew that if they had not done this, the Krell would have attacked another colony. And another. And the council would have formed more committees and accomplished nothing. Sometimes choosing between bad options and worse options was all you got. They talked for hours, finding some comfort in shared experience. Neither of them would ever be proud of what happened, but they could live with it because the alternative had been unacceptable. President Brooks addressed the nation 3 days after the fleet returned. She stood in the Oval Office and looked directly into the camera. Her speech was short and her tone was solemn. She did not apologize for the military action but acknowledged its severity. She spoke about the 48,000 colonists who died on New Haven and the responsibility of government to protect its people. 3 months had passed since the attack on Krell space. The galaxy had slowly adapted to the new reality that humanity was not a minor species to be ignored. Ambassador Paul Grant stood in the corridor outside the Galactic Council chambers and straightened his uniform. Today would be the first time Earth participated in a council session since the war began. The atmosphere inside the chamber was tense when Grant entered. Conversation stopped as he walked to Earth's platform and took his seat. Some ambassadors looked at him with hostility, others with curiosity or even respect, but no one looked at him the way they used to, with that dismissive attitude reserved for unimportant newcomers. That had changed forever. Chancellor Koresh called the session to order and immediately addressed the matter that everyone had been avoiding. The New Haven incident and Earth's military response. He spoke carefully, acknowledging that the Council had failed to adequately address the original attack. Then he presented a new set of regulations for territorial disputes and the protection of civilian colonies. Grant listened and realized that the proposals were almost identical to suggestions Earth had made 2 years ago. Back then, the Council had dismissed them as unnecessary complications to existing procedures. Now, after 48,000 humans died and the Krell military was destroyed, suddenly these ideas seemed reasonable. The regulations would require immediate Council investigation of any attack on civilian populations. They established clear penalties for territorial aggression. They created a rapid response mechanism for protecting colonies under threat. Everything Earth had asked for before New Haven burned was now being offered after the ashes had cooled. When the proposals were opened for discussion, Grant raised his hand to speak. The chamber grew quiet as he stood. He said that Earth appreciated these new regulations and would support them. But he wanted everyone to understand something clearly. These rules existed now because humanity had made them necessary. The Council had the opportunity to prevent this crisis and chose not to act. His voice was measured but firm. He said that Earth was not proud of what they had done to the Krell. War was terrible and the casualties on both sides were regrettable. But when humans asked for help and received only bureaucratic delays, when their people were murdered and the council formed investigation committees, Earth had no choice but to defend itself. Grant paused and looked around the chamber. He said that humanity hoped this would be the last time such action was necessary. They wanted to work within the council system, but the galaxy needed to understand that Earth would protect its people by any means required. If that made them barbaric in some eyes, so be it, but they would do it again without hesitation if faced with the same circumstances. Then he sat down and the chamber erupted in discussion. Some delegates condemned his statement as a threat. Others quietly agreed with his point. The Ventari ambassador started to respond, but Chancellor Kuresh cut him off and moved to vote on the new regulations. The proposals passed unanimously. Every civilization in the council voted to adopt protections that Earth had requested before violence became necessary. It was a bitter victory for Grant, knowing that it took a war to achieve what diplomacy could not. But at least the future might be different. After the session, several ambassadors approached Grant privately. The Torvan representative confirmed that major trade agreements had been finalized. Earth's exports of rare minerals and technological innovations would make them wealthy and economically important. The Hexians presented a formal mutual defense treaty proposal. 3 other civilizations expressed interest in establishing closer relationships with humanity. Grant accepted the offers graciously but remained cautious. Today's friends might be tomorrow's problems. Earth needed alliances but also needed to maintain independence. They had learned that relying on the Council for protection was foolish. Better to have friends but depend on yourself. The biggest surprise came from an unexpected source. A delegation from the Krell Empire requested a private meeting. Grant agreed, curious about what they wanted. The Krell ambassador was not Commander Vec. That individual had been removed from his position after the military disaster. The new ambassador was younger and spoke with genuine humility. He said that the Krell government wanted to negotiate a formal peace treaty and discuss reparations for New Haven. The new Krell leadership understood that their previous policies had led to catastrophe. They were prepared to make amends and establish better relations with humanity. Grant listened and asked where the Krell wanted to conduct these negotiations. The ambassador said that his government requested the negotiations take place at New Haven, at the site of the destroyed colony. Grant was surprised but agreed. It was fitting in a dark way. 2 weeks later, President Helen Brooks traveled to New Haven for the treaty signing. The colony had been partially rebuilt. New structures rose among the ruins of the old settlement. 50,000 people had died here, and now a few hundred had returned to start over. It was a testament to human persistence and refusal to be driven away from what was theirs. The Krell delegation arrived in a small ship, not the imposing warships they used to favor. They were escorted by human security to the memorial site, where the names of all 48,000 victims were carved into black stone. The Krell ambassador stood before the memorial for a long time, reading the names in silence. When the negotiations began, the Krell were prepared to offer significant reparations. They would pay for the complete reconstruction of New Haven. They would withdraw all territorial claims to human-controlled space. They would establish a permanent diplomatic mission on Earth to ensure communication remained open. And they would acknowledge publicly that their attack on New Haven was a war crime. President Brooks accepted these terms but added one more condition. The Krell must erect their own memorial to the New Haven victims on their homeworld of Krellvan. The ambassador agreed without hesitation. He said that his people needed to remember this tragedy, so it would never happen again. The treaty was signed with both leaders standing before the memorial wall. Images of the ceremony were broadcast across the galaxy. It was a powerful moment that showed both species choosing peace after conflict. Some humans protested that the Krell were not punished enough. Some Krell resented their government's submission to human demands. But most people on both sides recognized that peace was better than continued war. Admiral Richard Cole attended the ceremony, but did not speak publicly. Afterward, he met with some of the military officers who had led the strike against the Krell. Captain Andrew Harris, Commander Jake Morrison, and others who carried the weight of what they had done. Cole told them that history would judge their actions for generations to come. Some would call them heroes who defended Earth when no one else would. Others would call them war criminals who used excessive force. The truth was probably somewhere in between. They had done what they thought was necessary in terrible circumstances. But Cole also told them something important. Because of what they did, humanity now had a voice in the galaxy. Other species treated Earth with respect born from understanding human capability. The new council regulations would protect future colonies. The war they fought had purchased security for their people, even if the price had been steep. Harris asked if the admiral thought they made the right choice. Cole was quiet for a moment, then said he did not know, but he knew that doing nothing while colonists died was definitely wrong. Sometimes the best you could do was choose the lesser evil and live with the consequences. Back on Earth, society continued processing the war and what it meant. Dr. Nathan Pierce's laboratory received funding for new projects focused on defensive technologies and medical research. The president had made it clear that Earth would maintain strong defenses, but would not become a militaristic civilization. The antimatter warheads were kept in storage, ready if needed, but hopefully never to be used again. Schools taught students about the New Haven tragedy and the war that followed. The lessons were complicated because there were no easy answers. Teachers struggled to explain to children how good people could do terrible things for noble reasons. But perhaps that was an important lesson itself, understanding that the world was not simple and choices were often difficult. Lieutenant Maya Foster continued her intelligence work but now operated openly. Earth's spy network had proven its value and was expanded. But the focus shifted from gathering military secrets to understanding the galaxy's political landscape. Knowledge was power, and Earth intended to be well informed about everything happening in Council space. 5 years after the war, the Galactic Council underwent major changes. Chancellor Koresh announced his retirement after decades of service. The process of selecting a new Supreme Chancellor began with nominations from member civilizations. Traditionally, the position went to established species like the Ventari or Hexians, who had centuries of diplomatic experience. To everyone's surprise, Ambassador Paul Grant was nominated by 3 different civilizations. The Torvans argued that fresh perspective was needed. The Alanki said that humanity had proven itself capable of both military strength and diplomatic wisdom. Even the Krell supported Grant's nomination, seeing it as a way to demonstrate their commitment